The next day, I knew I had to leave Sabou. Whatever was happening here was beyond me. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to spend another night in that cursed village. But as I was about to leave, Bakari came to see me.
"You are leaving,"
he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. I nodded. I have to. She's too strong. I can't fight her. Bakari sighed, his face lined with worry.
"None of us can. But you must know, wherever you go, she will follow. You woke her, now she is bound to you."
His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean?
"She is no longer tied to this village alone. By speaking of her, by fearing her, you have invited her into your life. She will not stop until she has you."
I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. So what do I do? How do I stop her? Bakari looked down, his face etched with a sorrow that spoke of things long buried.
"You cannot stop her in the way you think. There is only one way to escape her. You must return to where it all began and finish what the elders started long ago."
I frowned, confusion mixing with my fear. What do you mean? Finish what? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper.
"The ritual that bound her, it was incomplete. The elders were desperate, afraid, and they only did enough to trap her. But there is a way to end her hold once and for all. You must go back to the house where she lived, and you must face her."
My stomach lurched. Go back to the house? The old one on the edge of the village? Bakari nodded gravely.
"It is not a simple task, and you must be prepared. There will be things in that house, things you cannot imagine. But if you do not do this, she will follow you forever. She will haunt your every step, and eventually, she will take you."
I spent the day preparing. Adama gave me more sage, more herbs, and told me to burn them once I entered the house. She didn't try to hide the fear in her eyes as she spoke.
"If you face her, do not show weakness. Do not let her see your fear, or she will consume you."
I nodded, though my hands were trembling as I took the bundle of sage. I felt like I was walking into my own grave, but there was no other choice. If I ran, she would follow. If I stayed, she would eventually get me. I had to face her. As the sun began to set, I made my way toward the house. The sky was darkening, and a heavy silence hung over the village. No one was outside. It felt as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. When I reached the house, the air grew colder. The old wooden structure loomed in front of me, half broken, with vines creeping up its sides. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for me to enter. I stood there for a long moment, my heart racing. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave and never return, but I couldn't. I had come too far. Taking a deep breath, I lit the sage and stepped inside. The inside of the house was worse than I had imagined. The walls were covered in strange, twisted symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. The air was thick, stale, and it reeked of decay. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I walked through the narrow hallway, and every shadow seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision. I reached the center of the house, a small, dimly lit room with a single window, cracked and dirty. In the middle of the room stood a large wooden chest, old and covered in dust. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. I knew this was it. This was where she had been trapped. My hand shook as I opened the chest. Inside, there were bones. Old, brittle, human bones. My breath caught in my throat, and I staggered back, the stench of death filling my lungs. But it wasn't just the bones that terrified me. It was her. The laughter started again, soft at first, then louder, filling the room. I spun around and there she was, standing in the doorway, her dark eyes gleaming with malice. Her face was twisted, her smile wide and full of teeth that were too sharp, too wrong. She stepped forward, her hands reaching out toward me.
"Let me in,"
she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. I backed away, holding the sage out in front of me like a shield. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice trembled. She laughed again, the sound echoing off the walls.
"You cannot stop me. You woke me and now I am free. I will take what is mine."
I felt my knees weaken, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't give in. I couldn't let her see my fear. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began the ritual Bakari had told me about. The words came out in a low chant, ancient and strange. I didn't understand them, but they felt powerful, like they carried the weight of centuries. The air in the room grew colder, and I could feel her anger rising as I spoke. She hissed, stepping closer, her eyes burning with rage.
"You think you can defeat me? You are nothing."
But I kept chanting, louder now, the sage burning in my hand. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, and the bones in the chest rattled, as if something was trying to escape. Her face twisted with fury, and she lunged at me, her claws outstretched. But before she could reach me, there was a blinding flash of light, and she screamed, a sound so terrible it made my ears ring. I stumbled backward, my vision blurry, but I kept chanting, my voice shaking with fear and determination. The room was filled with light now, and the symbols on the walls burned bright. She writhed in the center of the room, her body twisting and contorting, as if something was pulling her apart. With one final, ear-piercing scream, she vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The house was still now, the air clear, the darkness lifted. It was over, or at least I thought it was. I left Sabou the next morning, my heart heavy but relieved. The villagers didn't say much as I packed my things, but there was a sense of quiet respect in their eyes. They knew what I had done, even if they didn't speak of it. As I walked out of the village, Bakari stood at the edge, watching me go. He gave me a small nod, a gesture of thanks. I nodded back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. That night, as I lay in a small guest house miles away from Sabou, I finally let myself relax. The weight of the last few days lifted, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without fear. But then, in the dead of night, I woke to the sound of laughter, soft, distant, but unmistakable. And I realized, with a cold, sinking feeling, that I had made a terrible mistake. She wasn't gone. She would never be gone. And now, wherever I go, I hear it, the soft, eerie laughter following me in the dark. She is always there, just out of sight, just waiting. I don't know how much longer I can run, but I know this. She will never stop, and one day, she will find me, just like she finds everyone who hears her story. I didn't sleep much after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel her presence lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to slip. It didn't matter how far I went, how many miles I put between myself and Sabou. She was always there, always watching. I tried to keep moving. I crossed borders, staying in different towns, never staying in one place for more than a few days. But the laughter followed me, growing louder with each passing night. At first, it was distant, almost like an echo from a memory I couldn't escape. But soon, it became more frequent, more real. Sometimes it would wake me from a dead sleep, and other times, it would be waiting for me the moment I closed my eyes. I started to see her again too, not in the flesh. No, that would have been easier. She was clever. She knew how to stay just out of reach, just enough to make me doubt my own sanity. I would catch glimpses of her in the reflections of windows, a dark shape standing behind me, her smile wide and wicked. Or I'd see her in the corners of my vision, slipping behind trees, disappearing into the shadows. She never spoke, not like before. Now, it was only the laughter, always the laughter. I reached out to Abena again, desperate for answers. I called her from a payphone in a town far from Sabou, my voice trembling as I told her what had been happening. "You told me the ritual would stop her," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "But she's still here. She's following me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Abena finally spoke. Her voice was low, almost hesitant.
I warned you, didn't I? She's not something that can be so easily banished. The ritual was a temporary solution, a way to bind her to the house. But once you woke her, truly woke her, she became something more, something unchained.
"So what do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping in. "How do I stop her for good?" Abena sighed.
There's no easy answer. You've become tied to her now. She will follow you for the rest of your days unless...
Unless what? There was a long pause, and when Abena spoke again, her voice was cold, almost resigned.
Unless you pass her on to someone else.
The words hung in the air between us like a curse. I felt my stomach turn. "What do you mean, pass her on?" Abena's voice was flat.
She needs a new soul to feed on. If you want her to leave you, you'll have to give her what she wants. Someone else. Someone who hears the story, who believes in her. That's how she survives.
I felt sick. "You're saying I have to make someone else go through this?"
I'm saying it's the only way to save yourself.
She replied.
But remember, if you do this, you are condemning them to the same fate. She will follow them, haunt them, just like she's haunting you.
I slammed the phone down, disgusted. There was no way I could do that. I couldn't just hand someone over to her, couldn't doom them to the same nightmare I was living. But the nights grew longer, and the laughter got worse. I tried everything. More sage, more herbs, prayers, anything I could think of. But nothing worked. She was always there, always creeping closer, always laughing at me. It started to feel like my sanity was slipping away, like the lines between reality and nightmare were blurring. Then, one night, I saw her again, clear as day. I was staying in a small rundown motel, the kind where the walls were thin and the air smelled like mildew. I hadn't slept in days, and my nerves were shot. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I felt that familiar coldness settle over the room. I knew she was there before I even turned my head. She stood at the foot of my bed, her figure barely illuminated by the flickering light of the lamp on the nightstand. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and her smile, oh God, that smile, stretched too wide, her teeth sharp and blackened like before. But now, there was something different in her eyes, something more alive, more hungry. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me, her head tilted slightly, as if waiting for me to make a decision. And that's when I understood. She wasn't just haunting me. She was giving me a choice. For the next few days, I walked around in a daze, my mind turning over the horrible truth. She wouldn't stop unless I did what Abena had suggested, unless I passed her on to someone else. But how could I do that? How could I condemn another person to the same fate, knowing what I knew? But then, the laughter grew louder. It followed me everywhere, even in the daytime now, echoing in the back of my mind, haunting my every step. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think straight. And one night, after yet another sleepless stretch of hours spent lying in the dark, I made a decision. I couldn't take it anymore. I sat in a cafe the next day, staring at the people around me, wondering which of them would become her next victim. I hated myself for what I was about to do, but I didn't see another way out. If I didn't do this, she would take me, and I wasn't ready to die. Not like this. A young woman sat down at the table next to me. She looked to be in her early 20s, her face bright and full of life. She smiled politely at me, and for a moment I hesitated. But then, in the back of my mind, I heard it again. The laughter, louder than ever. I leaned over to her, my heart pounding in my chest. Have you ever heard the story of the wicked wife and her 7 husbands? The woman looked at me, confused but curious.
No, I haven't.
I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. It's an old African folk tale about a woman who married 7 men, and one by one, they all disappeared. And so, I told her the story, every detail, every chilling part of it. I watched as her eyes widened, as she leaned in closer, hanging onto every word. By the time I finished, her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly.
That's really creepy.
I forced a smile. Yeah, it is. She stood up after a while, still shaken, and walked out of the cafe. I sat there, staring at the empty seat where she had been, my stomach churning with guilt. That night, for the first time in weeks, the laughter was gone. I lay in bed, waiting, expecting her to appear, but there was nothing. No laughter, no cold presence, no shadowy figure lurking in the dark. I had done it. I had passed her on. She's always there, watching, waiting, and one day she'll come back. For me, for you, for anyone who dares to listen. So if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, you've heard her story now too. Be careful, because she might be watching you next. If you found inspiration in this story, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support will help others discover my journey and learn from it as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments. What did you learn from my story? Please like this page to encourage me to keep bringing more stories that resonate and inspire. Thanks for watching.